With the Melbourne Rebels having been booted from the competition starting next season, Super Rugby finds itself with fewer than 12 franchises for the first time since 1995 and the formation of SANZAR. Technically, I know that's not true. There's 2021, but that campaign had a whole host of unique challenges and feels like more of a footnote in Super Rugby history. The current situation is certainly a far cry from just a decade earlier, when ambitious expansion plans saw the competition really attempt to take over the rugby union world. Nothing though really went as planned, and Super Rugby finds itself basically back right where it started all those years ago. That though has not stopped officials from thinking about trying another round of global expansion, with these talks feeling, well, eerily similar to what we previously saw. How did we get here? And what does the future hold for Super Rugby or Super Rugby Pacific or whatever they end up calling the competition down the track? To help me answer those questions and more, I've enlisted the help of one of my favorite content creators, David Lim from the Lim Report, a New Zealander who covers a little bit of everything from the world of sport. I highly recommend checking out his channel, and you can find the link to that in the description of this video. Being in the Super Rugby, or Super insert number here, haven of New Zealand, he's watched this saga unfold firsthand. David, I believe the best place to start this story is with the introduction of the Melbourne Rebels and a revamped conference structure all the way back in 2011.
2011, the Super 14 becomes Super 15. Look, I guess when the news was announced that Australia was going to get a free franchise, it was kind of met with sort of muted. The response was kind of muted. I mean, this was 2020, 2011. Australian rugby had started its decline. It's not quite where it was. I mean, we've been a couple of years removed since the likes of George Gregan, Sterling Mortlock, Stephen Larkham had retired. You know, that was part of that great Wallabies team that won the World Cup in 1999 and nearly beat England for the 2003 Rugby World Cup. They played until 2007. Australian rugby was, things were starting to feel very uncomfortable with Australian rugby.
On the surface, having 15 teams made a lot of sense for what was then called the Super 14. It gave the competition 3 conferences of 5 teams, with each conference being made up of a specific country. However, getting the governing bodies in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa to agree on just how scheduling would work involved lots of negotiations and a series of compromises. They eventually would work out all of the kinks, and the newly rebranded Super Rugby competition began play in 2011. This format, it had some detractors, but there were also supporters of it.
I was actually on the side that actually liked this conference format. I guess, because I guess coming from the NFL background, I quite actually like having a New Zealand winner, South African winner, Australian winner. Look, I think ultimately it transpired that, the New Zealand teams were just so much stronger than the Australian South African teams, and you ended up in this scenario. I think the first season, 2011, the Reds finished top of the table, but, you would argue that they had an easier run.
The format would only be in place between 2011 and 2015. 2016 was seen as a huge year for both Super Rugby and rugby union as a whole. 2015, of course, is a Rugby World Cup year, and that usually means there's going to be a whole lot more attention played on club competitions in the aftermath of that. There was also the 2019 Rugby World Cup to be held in Japan. You had Argentina becoming increasingly competitive at the global level. For those running Super Rugby, this felt like a chance to expand the brand and become more of a global entity. A sense of urgency was also required since TV contracts were up at the end of 2015. The competition knew it needed to have those extra teams in place before it went to the negotiating table, so it could offer more games, more markets, all of that good stuff when trying to extract as much value from potential television deals. This led to all types of crazy, wild, pie-in-the-sky ideas to be floated. My personal favorite in all of this was the idea Super Rugby could have at least one team on every continent bar Antarctica. Look, logistically this seems impossible, but quite frankly, I thought it was an exceptionally cool concept worth exploring. Ultimately, the primary focus of expansion seemed to be locked in on Asia and the United States, but not everyone seemed to be on board with these plans. Everything at this stage, though, it was just speculation, and it kind of felt like Super Rugby maybe trying to lay out feelers, trying to see if anyone would bite on buying an expansion franchise. Also during this time, there were all types of closed-door negotiations between South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. That was mostly just jostling. South Africa in particular had been notorious for wanting to extract concessions from Super Rugby. As for those expansion talks, they really gained traction in 2014 and two de facto finalists emerged.
Yeah, so obviously this 2011-2014 format worked really well. Revenues were going up. SANZAR was one to expand. Super Rugby was on a riding a reasonably strong crest, and obviously, a big part for they were looking. Argentina had just joined SANZAR. They're going to a couple of seasons ago. They were wanting to expand the game. I think with the Pumas, they wanted to have a club where all of them could compete together, a bit like the New Zealand, Super Rugby teams, like the Australians, South Africans, because a lot of their players at the time were playing in France. So they thought, if we have a Argentina-based Super Rugby team, that'd be quite competitive. Of course, then they were looking at Japan as well. This was sort of I guess this was all this expansion talk happened just before the 2015 Rugby World Cup. So you have to put aside the fact that okay, Japan upsetting South Africa, that was not the reason why they wanted to get a Japanese team in Super Rugby. The talks were already there. Japanese rugby was already pretty much heading upwards, and Japan, of course, one of the biggest economies in the world. To have rugby in its foothold, have Super Rugby in its foothold there, would have been a huge boost.
As that was happening, a split between South Africa and Australia appeared. Both sides were really just playing politics in all of this, trying to get something they wanted from Super Rugby. Aussie sides made rumblings about not seeing the value of expansion. South Africa believed this was a necessity and operated shrewdly in a bid to get what they wanted, namely a sixth franchise in South Africa.
You had South Africa who, kept playing the political mind games. The South Africa, of course, they're sort of in the same time zone as Europe, completely different from like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and they have all this travel. So I think SANZAR had this big job of trying to placate, not just South Africa, they were trying to expand as well to include Argentina and Japan. And so, of course, South African rugby is really political, and this is as a result you get this expansion to 18, which I kind of felt was a bit rushed. I didn't think to 18 teams. I kind of felt Super Rugby wasn't quite ready for 18 teams in 2015. I just felt going from 15 and 18 in a stretch of 4 years with these new markets like Japan. I mean, Argentina certainly deserved it, but the Kings, it was more the Kings were only there for political reasons to please the South African Rugby Union.
In 2014, it was confirmed that Super Rugby would have 18 teams going into the 2016 campaign. The South African Kings and that Argentine side were confirmed as expansion franchises. However, Team 18 remained a bit of a mystery. All signs pointed to a franchise based in Japan. That would not be confirmed until nearly a year later, though, in 2015. From there, though, things would not be smooth sailing. The director of rugby, Eddie Jones, would leave that post in Japan to come coach the Stormers. A stint that would last all of 8 days before English rugby came calling. As Jones was busy sort of grifting his way around the world, Japan's Super Rugby bid had come into question. There were issues around their playing list and what exactly the Japan Rugby Football Union was doing. It was even rumored that Super Rugby had created contingency plans for a 17-team league structure should the Japanese franchise not be ready. Alas, those contingency plans were not needed. The soon-to-be-named Sunwolves were included when the 2016 fixture list was released towards the end of 2015. Everything was ready for an expanded extra super rugby season that spanned 4 continents and some 16 time zones if you go from east to west. As daunting as that sounds, there was a bigger issue with the 18-team Super Rugby format. It was extremely clunky. Australia and New Zealand were able to keep their country-specific 5-team conferences intact. South Africa was split into two 4-team conferences, one including the Jaguares and the other including the Japan franchise.
Obviously, there's the travel between South Africa and Japan. What they did was to have the games, the the Sunwolves South Africa games in Singapore as sort of like a midway point, and I kind of liked the idea. I was like, we could go to Singapore, the national stadium in Singapore. By then, of course, this was the new national stadium in Singapore. They'd built this brand new retractable roof stadium to replace the old national stadium in Singapore, and this was just kind of like the Singapore government's way to attract like international events like the New Zealand, the international rugby sevens, and this. Yeah. I mean, it was mixed, but there was a little bit of, I guess as we'd see, there was a bit of concerns about, red flags about this expansion.
Unsurprisingly, this didn't exactly click. For starters, the Kings and the Sunwolves were not particularly competitive that first season. More worryingly was the fact it felt as if Super Rugby had started to lose momentum outside of New Zealand. Attendance in South Africa and Australia was down. It seemed as if the competition was less competitive than it had been in the past. The Hurricanes snuffing out all comers on the way to the championship certainly did not help matters here. Super Rugby didn't even need to finish the 2017 season to understand things were just not working out as it had hoped. Organizers announced that 3 teams would be removed upon the conclusion of that 2017 campaign and that they would go back to a 5-team, 3-conference format.
Around this time, I think you could see that there were the inadequacies with Super Rugby, the administration. There was a lot of going from 18 is just never a good look. And I think this was ultimately the start of the decline for Super Rugby. And I mean, it certainly gave like South African rugby, kind of a bit more ammunition to like pull out. Which as you see in 20, once the pandemic came, that happened.
In Australia, the Western Force were shown the door. They would go on to create their own confusingly named league, Global Rapid Rugby. It was supposed to be this Asian Pacific rugby union competition, but really, more or less, it existed simply for the Western Force to win trophies. It would fold after 1 season. When you take a step back, though, and look at the decision to keep the Force over the Rebels, well, it was extremely controversial both at the time and even now in hindsight with the Rebels having been contracted.
It was the whole debacle about the Western Force, whether the Force or the Rebels. Who do we kick out? You had the Force, who, okay, it's in Perth, it's isolated from Perth isn't the biggest market in Australia, but the Western Force actually had the largest membership numbers, outcome, I think, possibly larger than the Brumbies, Waratahs, and Reds. And then you had the Rebels based in Melbourne, who never had a sellout crowd, never made the playoffs, never came close to making the playoffs, and they ultimately went for the Rebels.
Meanwhile, South Africa would lose the Cheetahs and the Southern Kings. Those 2 franchises would go on to link up with the Pro 14 in Europe. That is a decision that would have an outsized effect on Super Rugby in the future, even if no one realized it at the time.
And of course, the Kings was a disaster. Ultimately the South Africans, what they did was they shipped out the cheat when they were going to contract the competition of 16 teams. They sent the Kings and the Cheetahs to play in what's now the United Rugby Championship, and they were utterly uncompetitive there.
2018 brought the return of the 5-team, 3-conference format. The Sunwolves would slot in with the remaining Australian franchises, and the Jaguares would link up with the 4 South African teams. However, not even that change could stop this slide of Super Rugby. Whether that slide was real or perceived, who's to say? Things were fine in New Zealand, but Australia, South Africa, and Japan were all having issues. As the 2019 season progressed, the Japan Rugby Football Union announced it would stop funding the Sunwolves. With the club's sponsors not eager to cover that remaining shortfall the decision caused, the Sunwolves announced they were leaving after the side had finished up its Super Rugby commitments in 2020. I actually attended a Sunwolves match in Japan against the Reds a few days before news broke they were going to leave Super Rugby. It was an absolutely ridiculous game that kind of summed up the entire existence of the Sunwolves in a nutshell. They took a 21-5 lead only to fall behind 21-26 in the second half, gained a 31-26 lead, and still found a way to lose the game 34-31. The atmosphere was great. I had an absolute blast at that game. The Tokyo crowd also loves its rugby. The Sunwolves experiment, though, well, it was one that was never really set up to succeed, even from the onset, from the awarding of the expansion franchise.
I think the Sunwolves were just not prepared for this. I personally think, they were just trying to. I mean, I the Japanese competition was strong enough as it is. I just felt the Sunwolves were just such an odd mix. It was like a barbarians team, and in fact, it wasn't really even a Japanese national team. There were a lot of Aussies and New Zealanders, South Africans who ended up playing for it. It was a barbarians team just based in Japan. Just did not resonate, and then just ultimately felt really half pie.
Things were already in a precarious position for Super Rugby heading into 2020. Then the pandemic hit. Being an international competition so dependent upon international travel, well, it really just had an outsized effect on all of Super Rugby. Regionalized competitions would be held in both 2020 and 2021, although the league suffered some huge losses in between. The Sunwolves were officially folded in June of 2020 when their Super Rugby contract expired. The Jaguares, they just sort of disappeared after the 2020 season. It was never really clear if the Argentine side was simply not invited or opted against the burdensome commitment required to be based in Australia or New Zealand for an entire season.
It's a shame for the Jaguares because the Jaguares at that point were starting to become very competitive. They made the last two Super Rugby finals. It was a team on the up. And yeah, and it certainly benefited Argentine rugby, and just to have that suddenly disappear is, yeah, I think that was a bit harsh, but you could understand, of course, going from Argentina was one of the hot spots for the pandemic. There was no way they're going to go from, and also Argentina and South Africa for the matter, were the two countries most affected by the pandemic. So they were never, travel between Argentina, South Africa, and Australia and New Zealand was just never going to happen.
Eventually, with no future in sight, the players and coaches began taking jobs and positions elsewhere. However, the biggest loss of all came when the South African franchises announced that they were leaving Super Rugby altogether to join the Pro 14, which had been rebranded into the United Rugby Championship.
Yep. So pandemic. Yep. South Africans pulled out. It was all. It was yeah. I mean, it was ultimately it was the easiest get out of jail card.
Interestingly, the two existing South African sides playing in that competition would go away. The Kings were placed in administration, and the Cheetahs opted to move down a level. It was a tough pill to swallow for Super Rugby, although the move made sense. The time zones in South Africa always aligned better with Europe than Australia and New Zealand. There was also a lot of uncertainty as to what Super Rugby was going to be in 2021 and beyond. That 2021 ended up being, well, a thing that happened which probably shouldn't have happened. So the Australia and New Zealand based sides held separate country-specific competitions as they had in 2020. Then after that, everyone got together for a 5-round competition, Super Rugby Trans-Tasman, that saw all the sides play the teams from the opposite country. It was brutal. The Australian teams won 2 games in total. That's right. The Australian Super Rugby franchises went 2-23 against their New Zealand counterparts. It was just uncompetitive and ended a fairly unloved footnote in Super Rugby history. Speaking of the Kiwis, let's talk a little bit more about them. The one thing they've always wanted to get from Super Rugby was more competition. They didn't just want to have the same 5 New Zealand sides playing each other over and over again. Unfortunately, that competition has been in short supply. New Zealand teams have dominated Super Rugby over the years, and it's just never been able to come together as they have hoped. A reshuffling in preparation of the 2022 season saw Super Rugby expand for the first time since 2015. 2 new teams were added, Fijian Drua and Moana Pacifica, with a greater focus placed on being a Pacific competition, hence the new name, Super Rugby Pacific. This was a sensible strategy targeting 2 key areas for Super Rugby, although the results themselves have been a bit hit or miss. Drua have been competitive. They qualified for the finals both in 2023 and 2024. On the other hand, Moana Pacifica has won 7 games in 42 attempts, finishing bottom of the ladder bottom of the ladder, and second bottom of the ladder. The future of that franchise has come into question. In fact, there was that famed document that suggested the Melbourne Rebels would actually merge with Moana Pacifica. Of course, that never came to pass and the Rebels were given the boot, even though the team made the finals in 2024. More on that document in a minute. As for Super Rugby, it finds itself in I think you could say a slightly uncomfortable position, and a uncomfortable position that mirrors the sport of rugby union globally. There was a lot of promise and momentum for the sport in the late 2000s and early 2010s. In fact, that 2011 World Cup felt like the sport was having a moment. The competition was stronger, there was increased interest globally, and I think you just had a sense of hope and promise. Now, not so much. Similarly, for Super Rugby, it really felt it was on the upward trajectory in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Things were growing. It was a good spot to be in. But by the time that 2016 expansion hit, the momentum was lost, and it just really kind of felt like things were going in a decline that was only expedited by politics and the pandemic. The last vestiges of Super Rugby's 2016 expansion were the fact that 8 teams still made the finals. While this made sense with 18 or even 15 clubs, it was a bit underwhelming with only 12 sides playing. Thankfully, it appears as if that is changing for the 2025 season and beyond. When we zoom out and we look at the big picture of Super Rugby, the question has to be asked, where are we going right now? There have been some murmurings, which have become full-blown rumblings, that the Jaguares could return. It is welcome to hear, but also a development fraught with complications. For starters, most of that original Super Rugby side has been disbanded. You're going to need to build up the foundation from scratch, and that of course takes years to accomplish. Second, they would be almost farcically isolated from the rest of the teams in Super Rugby. Realistically, you need to create an entirely new conference with other teams somewhat closer by for the Jaguares to make it this go-round. That brings us back to the document which discussed a merger between the Rebels and Moana Pacifica. That document also contained a few lines about how Super Rugby was considering an expansion into the United States. More than a decade after first mulling the idea of a US franchise, it was once again back on the organization's radar. A team in Hawaii and the West Coast have been discussed. It feels far-fetched, like history repeating itself. Not only that, but expanding into America today as opposed to a decade earlier would be far more challenging. The US has a growing domestic league, Major League Rugby, which is still finding its footing, but is growing, and I think it's having some success. You'd likely run into a similar problem here that the Sunwolves faced in Japan, a domestic league that ultimately takes precedent over some random Super Rugby franchise. That though is a story for another time. Returning to Super Rugby, I think its fortunes are tied quite a bit to Rugby Australia finally getting its act together. South African sides aren't coming back. Simply adding more uncompetitive teams is not the answer. There really is a desperate need for the teams from Oz to be more competitive. It would boost the entire competition up and help get it back on the right track. There are quite a few reasons for optimism. The Super Rugby Commission is in place. A CEO has been hired, Jack Measley, who comes over from the A-League. The TV contract is soon expiring, so there's definitely a desire to have those expansion teams in place to have the league on steady footing. On the field, I think the Super Rugby product has been pretty good this season and even last season. You're seeing a good, watchable Super Rugby on-field product, and that's obviously very important here. This could be a new dawn for Super Rugby as it looks to emerge from its lost decade. Then again, it's the same thing many of us were saying at the start of that lost decade, so who really knows what to expect here? It would be easy to pile on and say it's a lost cause, but I, for one, am bullish on the future of Super Rugby. Thank you for watching this video, and a huge thank you to the Lim Report for contributing to this video. As I said earlier, definitely go check out his channel, link in the video description, and you can even watch one of his videos lower right hand corner of your screen. And if you want to know my thoughts on the NRL's foray into Las Vegas, upper right hand corner. Until next time, I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it up to the 25.